Here you have, if you don't know them, I'll give them a quick intro. Greg Orman, a real pioneer and our leader who ran for U.S. Senate as an independent in 2014 and is running currently for the governor of Kansas as an independent, and I believe will be the next governor of Kansas. Welcome, Greg Orman. Charlie Wheelan, the intellectual father of many children in this room.
Could we rephrase that?
Nope. No, Charlie has just been an incredible pioneer in this movement, and so glad to have you with us, Charlie, and thank you for your leadership. And, of course, Nick Troiano, the Executive Director of United America. All right. So here's what I'd like to ask you guys first, and I'll start with you, Greg. Where are we in this movement, and is it a movement?
You know, I think we're obviously making great strides. Just looking out today and seeing everybody here and comparing that to the feeling of loneliness I had in 2014, it's a remarkable difference. I think we've also done a far better job of organizing what is a group of very disparate efforts. I always used to say the problem with independents are they're independent. You know, they don't work together. And so I think I would agree with you what the work that Nick has done, the work that Chad Peace has done, and others in this room, just to bring together a community of people who so desperately want to create a third force in our politics and make it a force that actually works for people instead of for parties and for special interests. So I think we're making lots of progress. But I've always said Democrats and Republicans have been very rational and very dedicated for a very long period of time in pursuit of one thing, and that is getting their people elected. And for us to succeed, we have to be equally rational and equally dedicated. So what I would say is, while this seems like a long road for me, and I know a long road for Nick, who started on it with Unite America, I think we're just at the beginning of the road.
Yeah. Charlie?
I'm going to say that every good thing that's happened has been counterbalanced by a new challenge. So, for example, when I wrote the book in 2013, I thought, maybe I hoped that we'd hit political rock bottom. Little did I know. So obviously we've moved in a direction that's not auspicious, which means that more people obviously have woken up to the fact, well, what we're doing can't work. I mean, that's not a hard idea to sell. We have to do something different. And yet, so here's the challenge, at the same time, what you find is a response where I'm just going to dig my political trench deeper, right? So there's this paradox where I'm going to try and fix a system that I know is broken by doubling down on that system. And so in part, that is, and Nick can talk more about this, that although the parties have less attractiveness than ever before, they have greater appeal by pointing at the other party and saying, well, you may not be real keen on what we're doing, but they're so bad. And so this kind of yin and yang of, yes, it's broken, I know it's broken, but I'm going to do something that won't fix it. People look at what we're doing, they look at all the other efforts, they say, yes, something new has to happen. The challenge here is I have been shocked by the lack of imagination of people who consider themselves to be thought leaders. Journalists would be one. As a former journalist, I'm just appalled by the fact that journalists continue to kind of take a race and put it into the same old bucket, even as we are not in anywhere near that bucket. Political science, I can't even be in the room. I'm an academic. With political science, now I will tell you as an academic, what you do is you look at data. That's great. Where did data come from? The past. We don't have data on the future, right? So, I mean, they're great at telling you, look, if you look through the rearview mirror, you have a great view of where you've come from. You have no idea where you're going. So that, I think, frustrates me. So we have to do a better job of doing, seeing everyone here is terrific, of channeling what is an idea whose time has come and not forcing it on people, but persuading people who have this resistance and I think lack of an ability to see that we really can get to a better place.
Yeah, my perspective is that the biggest challenge we face, I used to think, was structural in the rules that independents face, in the infrastructure. What I've come to learn along my own journey is that the biggest challenge is psychological. It's just getting people to believe it can happen. And that's why I believe it takes time for this movement to form, because the challenge is that we have a double-sided sort of problem to solve at the same time. independent candidates don't run because there isn't a community of people to support independent candidates. That community doesn't exist because there aren't good candidates to support. And when voters don't see great candidates running or winning, they sort of assume that it can't happen. And so it takes time to build to the point where you can prove it can happen, and for this community to develop on both sides that it takes to win elections. And that's where I think we're just at the beginning of the journey, which doesn't grow linearly over time, it grows exponentially, and I think we're about to hit the hockey stick, which is this election, which is what can happen 80 days from now, when candidates running down ballot and statewide prove it can be done. And you bet you, by 2020, there are going to be more people running and more people ready to support them too.
Good, thank you. So getting a little bit personal, I'd like to hear from each of you about why you got involved in what this movement is and what was your catalyst to jumping in. Greg?
You know, for me, it was just a realization that what we were doing wasn't working. And, you know, it really happened for me about 2010. I'd always considered myself a political independent. As a 12-year-old, I managed John Anderson's campaign in our school's mock election. You know, I supported Ross Perot. But it really wasn't until 2010 that I realized if we didn't do something dramatically different, our standard of living, our status in the world, and the very existence of the middle class in America was at risk. And so I started an organization called the Common Sense Coalition, which is now a part of Unite America. The idea behind the Common Sense Coalition was to get us focused on the issues that I thought we needed to be focused on to move our country forward. And then I sort of took a step back and realized that despite the best efforts of a lot of very well-intentioned groups and organizations, the Concord Coalition, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the Peterson Foundation, nothing had changed. And if we didn't change the electoral incentives, we weren't going to change our country. And so, you know, for me, it was around that period of time in 2010 where I just decided we need to go in a fundamentally different direction. And that's another thing that I think it's important for us to recognize. We talk a lot about structural reforms. We talk a lot about what we need to do to create a third force in our politics. We can't lose sight of the fact for why we want to do it. You know, I look at what happened in 2016. Charlie describes it as rock bottom. I describe it as predictable. You know, ultimately, the average American household hasn't seen a pay increase since 1999. You know, think about that for a minute. The amount of time it takes a child to go from being born to graduating from high school, that's how long it's been since the average American household has had a pay increase. At the same time, what they spend so much money on, childcare, healthcare, higher education, have all outstripped the rate of inflation by wide margins. So for the average American, it doesn't feel like you're treading water, it feels like you're drowning. That's what this two-party system has brought people, is this belief that they can't make it in America. It's why 85% of Americans believe Washington is a rigged game that only benefits those people who can buy access to power. And you know what? They're right. And so while I came to it from a very intellectual spot, you know, from a spot of saying we're on a bad trajectory and we need to change it, we can't lose sight of the fact that this is about Americans, how they're feeling, and the fact that our system of government is leaving them behind.
I came at it from two directions, one of which is the same direction as Greg. Was I'm a public policy teacher. I actually taught class on Thursday. I got to go back on Tuesday. I've got a group giving a project on marijuana legalization, so maybe I'll take a picture of a dispensary while I'm here and go back. I cannot take any souvenirs. I think that would be looked upon badly in New Hampshire and Dartmouth. But so I'm a policy wonk, and I'm teaching a class that we're looking at entitlements, we're looking at the deficit, we're looking at environmental policy, and week after week, I'm saying, look, there are about 5 or 6 defensible policies here, all of which are better than anything we're doing. And it was just week after week. So on the policy front, I'm watching the fiscal situation move away from us. I'm watching climate change move away from us. I'm watching government get denigrated. And if you teach public policy, you know government is how you deal with these things. So on the policy front, I'm thinking, all right, this is deeply broken. And for me, when Simpson Bowles collapsed, I mean, for the policy wonks in the room, that was when I thought, oh, wow. I thought that process was going to allow us to get our hands around the fiscal situation, and it didn't. Then I had the political track, and these became an intersection. My first job out of college was writing speeches for the governor of Maine, who was an old New England Republican, the breed that's been hunted to extinction. I mean, they're probably in a museum somewhere, but so he was married to Olympia Snowe, who later left the Senate in frustration as a moderate New England Republican. I felt very comfortable there. Obviously, the Republican Party moved away from me. Many years later, I ran for Congress as a Democrat in a Democratic primary in Chicago, married to a tech executive who became a charter school teacher, and I realized I wasn't going to get out of that Democratic primary. And at that point, I was a person without a political home watching us not address the serious issues of the day. And, I felt lonely, like many people, and the one phrase that I hear more often in this room, other rooms like it is, and then I found you. And by you, I mean this. And so I was lonely, and then I found a place where other people would share this passion for solving problems and fixing the system. Because to Greg's point, fixing the system is about solving the problems.
My own journey was somewhat similar, coming at mostly through an issue I felt most passionately about, which was the trajectory of the federal budget, our national debt, being a younger person, seeing a future that looked less prosperous than our past because of decisions that were being made or more likely not being made today to address it. And when the government shutdown happened in 2013 over the healthcare fight, I realized we're going broke because our political system is broken, and we need to fix our politics if we want to address any of the issues we care about, whether it's the debt or climate or immigration or education. And so at that point, I realized my congressman who contributed to the vote to shut down the government came from a closed primary gerrymandered district in Pennsylvania, and he would not have any competition in the next election. That seemed wrong to me. So like any 24-year-old, I decided to go back home and run for Congress as an independent. And so I did that in 2014 and bootstrapped a campaign for a year and left that experience knowing that people are ready for this. The idea that I'm running to represent you and not a party or special interest across the board was resonant with people. The obstacle was, how do you mount a campaign that can be competitive against both major parties? That's the problem that I committed to trying to solve going forward.
So the last question I want to discuss, and then we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience, is when you look at the spectrum of movements, both historical and then some of the more recent ones that I mentioned, Occupy and the Tea Party movement, Black Lives Matter, and things that are being called a movement, how do we fit into that? And are we a movement? Just kind of talk about those questions. I think that'll be an interesting discussion. Anybody who wants to take it?
Well, one takeaway that I've learned from watching some other movements, particularly Women's March last year, was they said that we can be collective in action without being uniform in thought. And I feel like that really does represent this room. We all don't have to believe the same things to be collective in our action to unrig the system, to level the playing field, to introduce some new competition and participation. What I've also learned, and you mentioned this before, Joel, is that movements are bigger than organizations. I'm proud of Unite America. I think we're playing a key role in this, but this isn't the Unite America Summit. This is the Unite Summit. We're trying to break down those walls because I think as the movements that have succeeded did so under a larger banner. And I think our hashtag country over party is what I've seen organically come to be, other people using it, because that's what really this is all about. We're changing the paradigm from seeing politics as being divided between left and right and changing it to seeing politics as being divided between those who want to unite us to serve the common good and those who want to divide us to serve themselves. So I think having some overarching message that we can affiliate to without all having to believe the same things is what I think can emulate from the movements that have succeeded.
What strikes me about effective movements is they've got the fervor, the emotional pitch, the sense among a broad swath of people that something's deeply wrong, and they have objectives, not always absolutely agreed upon, but here are things we want to get done. And I think there's some movements that are very wonky, and here's what we're trying to do, but they don't have any emotional resonance. And then there's some that have an enormous emotional resonance, but after all the huffing and puffing is done, they haven't really moved the ball. And so when I think about something, I'd like to emulate the civil rights movement where you have got lots of sub-movements with various, we're going to desegregate housing, we're going to change this law, we're going to get these anti-voting laws, specific objectives organized around this broad principle of this is not right, this should not be legal, and together, we're going to march, but also lots of little sub-movements. One challenge for us in the room is taking lots of little groups that are all sailing in the same direction, but have not yet lashed our ships together, and to try and make something bigger out of these organizations that are doing broadly similar work, but have not yet created a synergy.
You know, and I would say as we look at movements, the two most recent ones that I think are very instructive for us are the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement. Both movements actually born out of the same set of actions. Both born out of frustration with the bank bailouts and the belief that we were bailing out Wall Street while people's homes were being foreclosed upon. The Tea Party and Occupy took very different approaches to it. The Tea Party decentralized their leadership. They allowed you to organize if you wanted to organize. I think there are 3 separate official Tea Party organizations in my home state of Kansas, as an example. And they got involved early in electoral politics. And so there was this sort of symbiotic relationship between candidates and the Tea Party. Candidates gave the Tea Party credibility by showing up to their events. The Tea Party gave the candidates credibility. And it all worked in a very decentralized way. Occupy, on the other hand, didn't get terribly involved in electoral politics, was more centralized in how they were organized, and I would say basically ineffective. And in some senses, maybe they found their sea legs in 2016 when a lot of them got behind the Bernie Sanders campaign. But again, that was 9 years later, after the Tea Party had already had what I would argue is a pretty significant effect on our politics. And that's why I like what we're doing here and what Joel talked about, because we need to recognize for this to succeed, we need thousands of leaders. We don't need 2 or 3 leaders.
Yep. I think it's a really important point. And when I think about the civil rights movement specifically, it's a good one to study in terms of the ecosystem. They absolutely had these 8 kinds of leaders and also organizations. When you think of the civil rights movement, you don't necessarily immediately think of, say, the NAACP or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Those were incredibly important organizations that facilitated things that happened. And so we've got organizational leaders in the room. You had all of these different types of people who were coming together to make this thing happen. So can I get a quick time check from somebody? Anybody? 9?
You got 15
Oh,
minutes.
perfect, great. All right, so what we want to do is take probably 2 or 3 questions from the audience and let the panel discuss, specifically around this idea of movements and a movement. Are we a movement? Anything that has a question that may resonate around that, and you can just shout it out and I'll repeat it. Yeah, right here.
Thanks, Bob Colts from New Mexico. If you look at what Evan McMillan did, your involvement, Greg Orman, how do independent candidates running not successfully contribute to what you've done?
Great question, Bob. So the question is, how do independent candidates running, even not successfully, contribute to the movement? Is that the right question? And thanks, Bob from New Mexico. I'll let you guys take it. I have an answer, but go ahead.
As an independent candidate who lost, I'll take that question. I describe it sort of in 3 ways, which is, 1, the impact that candidates make just by the purpose of running is that you can advocate for issues that would otherwise get ignored by the 2 major parties. An example of that, for example, when I ran was, we put out our own plan to make Social Security solvent that forced the congressman to have to say something about Social Security, which he'd be perfectly happy to ignore. It also forces, or it allows an opportunity to organize people that have never been organized before. One of the greatest things that happened after the campaign were the independent candidates who subsequently ran in the district both for Congress and down ballot. And I think it also forces some accountability. These are districts, a lot of them across the country and on a state legislative level, 40% go uncontested in a year. Think about that. 40% of our state legislative districts only have 1 candidate on the ballot in November. And that's because a lot of them are gerrymandered that they're safe districts for R's or D's. So independents that get out there and run force competition. And I think that has a healthy impact for democracy and hopefully can serve as a catalyzing force for independent voters and independent organizations to get organize and build strain so the next time someone runs, it can happen even more effectively.
Yeah, good answer. And I think we had a meeting last night about talking about data, just the sheer value of the operation that happens around a campaign. If it's a House race, you're going to have thousands of people that you're going to get their information, you're going to engage them. If it's a bigger race, you have tens of thousands or millions, and that data has real value. And so the operation of running a campaign has a tremendous opportunity for value. The key, and one of the things that we're tackling even as we speak, is how do we capitalize and capture that data. Let's take one from over here. Yeah, Jackie. Okay, I'll try to restate that as best I can. Typically, movements have grown up around issues, and those issues can very often, or do very often, get co-opted then by one party or another. So the Tea Party grew up, and then basically the Republicans co-opted them, as an example. And so Jackie's question is, how is this different, as it's not quite as issue-centric, though there are uniting principles around kind of what we're all doing. And is this a different paradigm that we're seeing now?
Yeah, I would actually say it is very much a different paradigm. And you know, one of the things and one of the challenges I have as a candidate is to get the press and others to sort of see this race along dimensions that aren't purely ideological, that aren't purely issue-based. And you know, I think that's what Unite America has tried to do. I think that's what this movement is about. It's not simply about one issue or another, though a lot of us came to it because of our belief that if we didn't change our politics, we wouldn't solve problems. But as Nick said, you know, things like country over party are starting to resonate with people. And I tell people that this politics is not two-dimensional. It's also about an approach to politics. It's about who you value, who you're working for. And so ultimately, I think this is very different, very difficult to co-opt. The other thing I would reinforce what Nick said, this is all psychological. You know, at this point, our success, the barrier to our success is all psychological. 44% of Americans self-identify as politically independent. You know, 49% of Republicans, 52% of Democrats believe we need a third party. You know, think about that. The vast majority of Americans want something like this. I tell people Democrats and Republicans are the two worst consumer brands in the world because they're defined exclusively by negative advertising. If Coke and Pepsi behave that way, you know, Pepsi said Coke made you 3 inches shorter. Coke said Pepsi made your hair fall out. No one would drink Coke or Pepsi. The fact that we aren't given alternatives and the fact that we have that psychological barrier to overcome is frankly the biggest impediment to our success. But this is very much different than what we've seen in other independent movements.
Let's take another question from over here. How about Dr. Diamond?
I come from a rural district, and I'm curious how many people here identify as rural? Because I would argue in my area, Republican is rural and Democrat is Seattle. That's the battle in Washington. And so I would like to hear your comments about how you, in a rural area, which prides itself on small town and getting along, independents want to get along with everybody, how you would hold the rural and the urban divide.
All right, who wants to take that one?
I'm going to give it to Greg because you're running in a state that's urban and rural.
Yeah, I am. And in fact, my running mate, State Senator John Dahl, is sitting in the back of the room right now. He made the brave decision, the courageous decision to go from being a Republican to re-registering as an independent to run with me. John would tell you this, and in his conversations that he has with rural Kansans, he asks them a really simple question. What have the Republicans done for you? And, you know, so he believes, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but John believes that the right way to deal with that sort of rural-urban divide is by going directly at rural voters and asking them that very simple question, which is, what has the party really done for you? And I think what he's found is generally the answer is crickets. You know, there are people who resonate with the Republican Party in large part around values-based issues. But ultimately, you know, we're dealing with a potential trade war right now, which could be very damaging to rural Kansas. They've been very reluctant to allow us the freedom to farm things like industrial hemp, which could be very good for Kansas. They're talking about immigration policies that everybody in rural Kansas knows would decimate us economically. And so John talks about it really in the context of, look, this is about improving your lives. What have they done to improve your lives? You know, the other thing we've done, obviously, is we've decided we want to bridge that rural-urban divide in large part by having a ticket that has a strong and powerful voice for rural Kansas on it, and someone who lives in a more urban area of our state. And so we're trying to take a very practical approach to it as well.
And I would piggyback on that again with a little bit of what I was talking about is we need the different kinds of people that are part of making this movement, and we need them to represent the rural and the urban. And so, in other words, we have to really put our money where our mouth's at. If we believe that we have a message and a platform and an approach that will resonate with rural voters, we need to engage them and include them in that, and not simply take the model of the 2016 election, if I may, where one candidate just told them what they wanted to hear and the other one acted like they didn't exist. Instead, we connect them. And we bring them in and we explain to them and we let them tell us, what do you think needs to be a part of this? How do you want to connect? And I've seen Dr. Diamond do it. I've seen Jared Applewhite do it. I've seen others who are saying as candidates, you tell me, rural voter, what do I need to be looking at? We're going to take one more question. And I think we had, where was he at? Yeah, Marty Groman over here.
Hey, thanks, Joel. Thanks for a great panel. So, yeah, I'm independent state rep Marty Groman of Maine, also running for U.S. Congress. So what I'm interested in is, do we have an opponent? So I'm a Red Sox fan, right? We kind of need the Yankees, right? We got to have someone to go against. Does our movement have someone that, or something that we oppose? And if that's true, what is that?
I think it's the system. It's the two-party oligopoly, and it's not necessarily the people in the system. I am thoroughly convinced that there are a lot of very good people trapped in a very bad system, and whether it's at Congress or at the state level. So our enemy is a system that doesn't adequately represent people, particularly independents. I mean, I always force people to do the math. If there are 43, 42% of a country identifying as independent, regardless of what that means, then the Senate, which is 100 people, this isn't hard math, should be about 42 independents, whatever that means, right? So that system is not mapping preferences onto who governs. It's not giving outcomes that people want. So I think our enemy is better than the Yankees or the Red Sox, which is that, look, do you think it's working? Do you think it's going to self-correct if you don't think it's working? And if not, then join us.
I would echo that too. I mean, you know, one of the things that we talk very much about is a corrupt two-party system that's not serving the needs of Americans, but putting the needs of party bosses and special interests ahead of them. You know, I was talking to Kyle Bailey from Maine, and he said they're using a line which I've used before in ads, which is to say you can't spoil a rotten system. And people get that. It resonates with people, and it feeds very much into their belief that this system isn't working for them.
I know we want to wrap up, but before we do, I want to just give Greg an opportunity because there's some people in the room just curious the status of your race, the post-primary. How are things going in Kansas before we break for the morning?
You know, I think things are going well. We've obviously just gone through a primary, and so all of the attention for the past basically 4 to 6 weeks was on the Republican and the Democratic candidates. It's one of the things that I think is a structural problem. In fact, I wrote an op-ed recently about the need for an independent primary for the sole and simple reason of giving independents media attention, because the media doesn't want to cover issues. They don't want to cover the relative merits of the candidates. They want to cover horse races and be political pundits. But, you know, we're now into the last 80 days. We know our opponents. We think we have a good path to victory. We are going to have to motivate the 31% of Kansans who are unaffiliated to get out and vote. And we're going to have to appeal to both moderate Republicans and Democrats. You know, I think John and I have been traveling the state. We've been getting really good feedback everywhere we go. And ultimately, I think we're in a position to win the race, but it's going to be a lot of hard work and a lot of effort, and we're going to need a little luck over the next 80 days.
I want to append an answer to an earlier question, which is, although we learn a great deal when independents lose, you know what's really good? Winning.
Yeah. All right, that's a good way to end.